You guys can see the screen well and my mouse.
Sorry, can you repeat?
You can see the screen and the mouse?
Yes.
Yes. I'll mute myself.
Should I just get started whenever, or are we waiting a little bit longer?
Let's wait for maybe 2 minutes, 3 minutes,
okay.
For, because we have 13 people here, so we need to wait a few more.
Yeah. It's nice that even that hasn't changed with online seminars, that people still show up late.
Yes, it's true. We always have the 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, we have that too. It's just funny, right? Because it's like everyone's sitting in front of their computers anyways, presumably.
Yeah. There is no reason to be late. Juliano has just told me that he will be a few minutes late here. He asked me to not wait for him, but he will be, because he will be a bit late. Okay, let me see. I think more 2 minutes, no, Márcio, maybe.
Whatever you prefer. So yesterday I was listening to this paper from Stephen Davis and Nick Bloom about working from home. Have you seen the very interesting, but they didn't mention the fact that this very thing about showing up late did not change.
Right. Hard to measure, I think.
Yeah. 1 more minute and then I will introduce you. Yes, I think we can start. So I would like to thank you, Christine, for accepting our invitation. We will start our seminars, our week seminars today. And today we have Christine Braun from the University of Warwick, and she will present. She works with macro and labor, and she will present her paper on aggregate job search of the employed and unemployed and non-participant. Christian, you have 1 hour and 15 minutes. If you need more time, we can allow you. And I think people will start asking you questions in the middle of the presentation. Okay?
Sounds good.
You can start.
Okay, well, yeah, thank you for having me. Like I said, I wish I could be there, but this is how things are. So we'll make the most of it. Okay, so the motivation for this paper is quite simple, actually. It's kind of a backstory of how I came up with this idea, but I was on the Bureau of Labor Statistics website, looking at some of their statistics for the US, and I came across this table. And they publish this table every single month. And what they do is they look into the current population survey, which is the standard survey in the US for calculating any labor market statistics. And they match people across 2 consecutive months. And then they look, where did they come from? Were they employed, unemployed, or out of the labor force? And where did they go the second month? And there's 2 things that really stood out from this for me. So what these numbers are total levels in thousands of people. Right, so we have 142 million people who in the US were employed in 1 month and employed in the next month. And so the 2 observations I made here was, the first is that there's relatively large oscillations between people switching from unemployment and out of the labor force. All right, so this is this number right here. Last month there was, so this is actually from February 2020. So in January 2020, to February 2020, 2 million people went from unemployed to out of the labor force. And if you compare that to the unemployed that actually found jobs, which is 2.5 million, we find that really unemployment is not a very persistent state here. People are switching to employment, people are switching out of the labor force, and that was kind of puzzling. And then the second observation I made was this number right here. If you look at this number, this is the number of people who in January were considered out of the labor force and in February said that they were employed. So that's 4.2 million people in the US. And if we compare that to how many people of the group that we typically consider job seekers became employed from January to February, it was only 2.5 million. So really the flow here from out of the labor force to employment is much, much larger than the flow from unemployment to employment. And I kind of thought, okay, well, is the unemployment rate really then the best measure of labor force or labor underutilization if we consider that we really care about hires, right? That's really what's driving the labor market. So I looked a little further into this to see if this was just a strange thing that happened recently, but it's always been this way, right? So here's basically those numbers as a time series starting in the 1980s. You can see that the number of hires coming out of unemployment has been pretty steady around 2 million. It goes up during recessions, falls during recoveries. But the fraction is coming from out of the labor force, or even in the 80s was higher than the fraction coming from unemployment, but that number has just been increasing with time. And now we're at this point where if we look at just non-employed individuals, about 2/3 of employment from non-employment is coming from people who are classified as out of the labor force, people who we typically consider are not looking for a job. And the green line here, just as a comparison, I've also plotted people who are a new hire and were previously employed by a different job. So these are job-to-job transitions. And if you consider 2019 and consider all hires, still out of the labor force is the largest pool from which we're pulling hires. Then I explored this a little further, and this is not a problem that's exclusive to the US, right? So you can do the same thing for Europe. You can go to Eurostat and you can look at the flows. And I've just picked 3 countries here to make or 4 countries to make a point, 3 of which have the same issue that the US has. In Denmark, there's more people coming from inactivity or out of the labor force to employment. In Italy, there's more. The UK has the same issue as the US. It looks like it's about 2/3 coming from out of the labor force and only 1/3 coming from unemployment. Spain, on the other hand, is the opposite way around, which I think is interesting in itself, considering that we believe the unemployment rate to be consistent in Europe across all these countries. So when we always say, oh, Spain has a very high unemployment rate compared to the UK or Italy, we're really not measuring the same thing, right? Because Spain's unemployment rate does seem to be capturing the hires better than sort of the unemployment rates across the other countries. So where does the problem start? It starts with the definition that we use for unemployment. And the reason this is a problem across all countries is because this definition is standardized across all OECD countries. And so the standard definition that we use is you're considered, so let me back up and say that I'm going to consider this method of counting unemployment as an in or out approach. What I mean by that is if you answer yes to this question, you're considered in. If you answer no, you're out. But once you're in, we don't care if you search more or search less. We just count you as unemployed, and all unemployed people are going to be exactly the same. And so the criteria that you have to fill is that you have to have at least 1 active search effort over the past 4 weeks, and you have to be available to work. And then, like I said, if you fit in that criteria, we don't care how much you're searching, how many hours you want to work. If you do become employed, there's no sense of an intensive margin in the unemployment rate. So these measurement issues that I've mentioned are well known in the US data. So starting in the 80s, there was a couple of papers that looked at this measurement issue when the CPS decided to do what were called the re-interview surveys, where they would interview somebody twice in 1 month and see if they had the same labor market status with the same interview just 2 times in the same month. And more recently, there's been sort of new papers writing about the same thing again, really saying this is a big issue in the US. But for the most part, most of these papers are still using this same in or out approach. And even the Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes different measures of unemployment, including different types of people. But again, it's always the same approach. It's this in or out approach. So the thing I'm going to do instead is I'm going to classify people probabilistically based on search effort rather than in this deterministic in or out approach. So
May I
this
ask
is
you a
going
question?
Yeah.
Regarding hours, do we have any
Mhm.
information whether the transition from out of the labor force directly to employment leads to employment of lesser hours than otherwise?
So I haven't looked at that specifically, but I will show you that my estimate of search effort is positively correlated with hours worked once you do get a job. And the people who are out of the labor force, I do predict them to have less search effort. So I would assume that those people are working less hours on average when they become employed. But I haven't actually looked at that number specifically. So
Thanks.
yeah. Right, so that's another thing that this measure, my adjusted measure of unemployment is going to be able to capture well, because it's this probabilistic measure, meaning that once you're considered in unemployment, I'm also weighting people differently, right? So somebody who seems to be searching a lot and wants to work a lot of hours is going to have a heavy weight in the unemployment rate versus someone who's not searching very much, doesn't find a job quickly, doesn't want to work a lot of hours. They're weighted a lot less in this probabilistic sense. So it's going to sort of bypass these measurement issues, and it's also going to include this intensive margin. Yep.
Let me ask one thing. Do they have to prove that they are looking for a job, that they are searching for a job? So they just say, I try one in this.
Yeah, so because this definition of unemployment doesn't have to do with them getting unemployment insurance, they're just trying to measure how many people are looking for a job. They don't need to verify anything. I think if they want to apply for unemployment insurance, which would be a different statistic, then they would have to verify those things in the US.
Hi, Christine, may I ask you a question?
Hmm?
Yeah, this issue always bothered me as well in terms of how to look at unemployment and everything. But one thing that that varies a lot across countries is, and actually it varies sometimes within the same country, is the way the surveys ask about these efforts to find a job. So in Brazil, there was some changes recently that included more questions to actually check if the worker is actually looking for a job or not. And that resulted in there was actually an increase in unemployment. Well, there was an increase because of a lot of methodological changes, but people think that this part was actually very important for the level of unemployment. My question is, do these recent papers, do they also, or your paper as well, I think your paper is going in a different direction, but have these recent papers looked at these changes in definition over time or changes in definition across countries?
Yeah, so I mean, the definition of unemployment within the survey that I'm going to be using has stayed constant. The definition with respect to like search effort or how we're measuring search effort, whether it be like how much time people are spending filling out job applications or how many applications they're filling out or whatever the measure of search effort is, I mean, the data is much more limited, right? So in the US, we basically have 2 main sources that we can use there. Is the American Time Use Survey, which I'm going to use, and then there's the Survey of Consumer Expectations, which has a labor market supplement, which measure search effort quite similarly. Well, there they ask them outright, like how many times have you searched, how many applications have you filled out? In my measure, it's a time use survey. So you're filling out a day's worth of activities. And yeah, the measures don't line up perfectly. They line up quite well in like the fraction of people that are searching, but they really do not line up well in the amount of time people say that they're searching. So that's another reason why I'm going to sort of stay away from using an intensive margin of search effort like time, because yeah, we really don't, I mean, we don't know which survey is right. We have these two surveys, they're giving different answers. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we need to figure out, but I'm just going to sort of try to stay away from that for this paper. Okay. So how am I going to do this probabilistic classification? Is the first step is I'm going to construct a probability that everybody is searching for a job. I'm going to show you guys that this is really a measure of labor force attachment, in the sense that people who have a higher predicted probability of searching, they have higher job finding rates, they work more hours. And that probability that I'm going to estimate, I'm going to use as a weight. And so the adjusted unemployment rate is just going to be the weighted average of the group of non-employed individuals. And like I said, this sort of bypasses this classification problem that we have in the data. And then what's unique to this paper also, which the other papers can't do, is I can calculate a total searcher rate. So I can calculate basically a fraction of the entire population, whether they're non-employed or employed, that are searching for a job. And really, I'm going to consider this as sort of the most comprehensive measure of labor market health or labor market activity, right? So even the people that are employed and searching for a job, I'll show you that they have higher job finding rates, and they also end up working more hours at their new job the more they search. And then the last thing I'll do is I'll adjust the labor market flows as well. And just as a note, sort of thinking about this more intensive margin of unemployment, we already do this for employment, right? We don't often just count the number of employed. We also care about how many hours they're working. A lot of times in our macro models, we plug in total hours or full-time equivalents if we're doing a head count. We don't just count raw employed people. So it's going to be very similar to that idea, just applying that to unemployment. Okay, so how am I going to do this? I'm going to use two sources of data. The first one is this American Time Use Survey, which I just talked about, which is going to contain all the job search information that I'm going to use. And the second one is the Current Population Survey, which I said is the survey used to create all the labor market statistics in the US. And then the empirical strategy is going to basically be 3 steps. So the first step is I'm going to use this, the data in the job search in the American Time Use Survey. I'm just going to do a machine learning algorithm that because I want to maximize the predictive effort of my model. Then I'm going to take that model and predict job search effort for all the individuals in the CPS. And from there on, I can construct all the statistics that I want to construct, because I'm using the same underlying data that the aggregate statistics come from. Okay, so what's going to come out of this is basically 3 main points. The first one, we kind of already know some of this, which is that search effort across all groups, so employed, unemployed, and those that we thought were not searching for a job, search effort from them is going to be counter-cyclical. I'm going to show that there's been a large increase in the fraction of those people classified as out of the labor force that are searching for a job. And then I'll show that once you consider all non-employed individuals that are searching for a job, or even all people in the economy that are searching for a job, this is going to really decrease labor market volatility. And so there's basically 2 points I make on why this really matters. So the first is going to be concerning how well this sort of standard workhorse search and matching model can mimic the labor market. So we know that this fails very, it's well known that this fails on matching the volatility of the labor market tightness through the wage. And people have done a lot of research on trying to, in some sense, fix the model, right, to make the model match the data. I'm really just saying, let's reassess the data. Maybe something's going wrong there. And I'll show that the volatility of the tightness actually decreases by up to 40%, which is taking a huge step on moving the model closer to the data. And the second part is, more recently, we've shown that these large and volatile oscillations that I showed at the beginning, moving from unemployment to out of the labor force, also the standard search and matching model has a very, very hard time matching these changes in participation. And Per Krusell and co-authors have a whole series of papers, with the last one basically concluding that the only way that we can get the search and matching model to match these participation decisions is by having large preference shocks. So by having large transitory shocks to the disutility of searching. What I'm going to show is really that this large oscillation between these two states is purely measurement error. And once you account for that, this oscillation is going to go down. So your standard search and matching model is going to have a much, much easier time to match these flows without using preference shocks. And then sort of from a more a greater macroeconomic perspective, I'm going to show that it also matters in this ongoing discussion about the flattening of the Phillips curve and this change in the natural rate of unemployment, and trying to be able to estimate a time varying natural rate of unemployment without perfectly matching a Phillips curve, right? So there's that dichotomy that we can't solve. And what I'm going to show is really there is no trend in the underlying unemployment rate. And it's just mismeasurement that's causing the trend, which is making people believe that there's a decrease in the natural rate of unemployment. And I'm just going to estimate a very simple Phillips curve and show that if you have a natural rate of unemployment that's constant and you estimate a Phillips curve on the adjusted unemployment rate, there's no change in the slope parameter. Okay.
Christine, can I ask a question? Can you give us a sense of the order of magnitude in the change of unemployment you find in your paper?
Yeah, so I'll show you the rate. It's the level, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so on average, it's going to be about 5.3 percentage points higher. So it's almost 50%.
Much higher.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it is high. And the way that I justify that is, right, look at the flows. I mean, you have 4 million people coming from out of the labor force. Those people need to be searching for a job, right? We need to add those people into the unemployment rate. Right.
And just another question. Would that make a lot of difference in terms of how unemployment was measured during the first months after the pandemic, the COVID? Because there was this huge increase in unemployment in the US, and people were in the Bureau of Labor Statistics were unclear on how to define these people, if they were actually looking for a job or not. Maybe this would be another way to motivate your paper. I was just asking in this direction.
Yeah, so I mean, I'm also going to show that sort of my adjusted unemployment rate also has a huge increase in the recession. So it's a bit tricky, because what I need to assume to create the adjusted unemployment rate is that search behavior itself doesn't change within demographic groups, right? So it's really hard for me to say whether or not they're actually searching for a job, because I need to assume, I mean, I think, let me answer this question slightly better. Once we have this time use survey for 2020, we can answer that question. We don't have that data yet. Yeah. Okay, so that's a nice transition.
Christine,
so let me talk about where this data comes from.
Christine,
so it's the time use survey. Yeah.
Yeah, Julian speaking here. Just to follow up on the first Gustavo's question. Do you have any kind of inference on the welfare changes associated with this change in the natural unemployment rate? Because since you have the search and all the matching that will be associated with it, probably the impact on welfare will not be as big as what's captured by the unemployment change, right? In the natural rate, and I wonder if this would allow workers to live in a world in which they can handle better the unemployment. Somehow.
Right. So, I mean, the issue with saying anything about welfare for me is that I'm not going to write down a formal model. So I can't really estimate any sort of welfare function. yeah, so really I can't, with what I'm doing in this paper, I can't really answer any questions like that because I would need to write down a formal model, which I have not done. But I mean, it's a good thing to sort of think about because it does change, right, all of our statistics. So it must change our even welfare implications of unemployment insurance, right? I mean, those are all big questions that sort of are now back open when you think about unemployment this way. But yeah, no, I don't have a good answer to that right now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the time use survey, what's really nice about this survey and why I'm using this survey compared to the other source that we have in the US for search effort is that it's a subset of the CPS, the current population respondents. So after they complete their final interview, 2 to 5 months later, they get asked to be in this American Time Use survey, which means that all of the questions about labor force status are asked again, and everybody is categorized identically to the way that they were categorized when they answered the questions in the CPS. And all of the demographic information is asked and everything is the same across the two surveys, really. So they're very easy to link. So what the survey does is it's a one-time survey, so it's not a panel. And it asks people for one specific day, what they were doing, where they were doing those activities, who was with them, and to record how long they were doing these activities throughout the day. And then all of the activities that they report doing get categorized into, I think, maybe over 400 categories, huge number of categories. And the ones that I'm going to be focusing on are just these job search categories. Okay, so here's some sample statistics from that job search category. So what I've done here is I've grouped this by labor force status, and this daily probability of job search is basically just the mean variable, or the mean of a dummy variable for if the employed person searched for a job on the day of the interview. So if you do that, you get a very, very, very small number of people searching for a job on the day of the interview. Again, it's a daily survey, so we would expect that number to be fairly small. Even for the unemployed who do say that they're searching for a job on the interview day, only about 17% of them are searching for a job, and people classified as out of the labor force, only about 0.4% of them are searching for a job. But what you can do is you can take these daily probabilities and sort of naively aggregate them up to monthly probabilities by assuming that this daily search probability is independent across days. And if you do that, you aggregate up, basically doing 1 minus the cumulative product of not searching for 30 days in a row, you get these statistics here, these monthly probabilities. So the way that you want to interpret these monthly probabilities is the probability that an employed person searched at least 1 day of the month, right? Which is the same measure that the current population survey uses as their statistic, right? You have to have 1 active search effort throughout the month. So that's basically the statistic. So if we look at that for the employed, it makes sense. We get that basically the entire group of employed is searching for a job at least once throughout the month. The unemployed. The employed, we get about 16% of the population is searching for a job throughout the month. And the out of the labor force, we get 11%. So then we can also look at this minutes per day. So this is the one where I was saying is not quite comparable to the other job search survey that we have. And these are minutes conditional on searching for a job. So conditional on an employed person searching for a job, they search for about 2 hours per day. But if we focus here on the non-employed people, they look very similar, right? Conditional on searching for a job, they search a little bit over 2 hours per day. And so these numbers for the out of the labor force group, they become even larger when you focus on prime age workers, right? So prime age workers, about 25%, so 1/4 of the prime age out of the labor force group is actually searching for a job. And again, they look very similar when you compare the unemployed to the out of the labor force on how much they're searching. We can go one step further and ask, well, what are they doing when they're searching? They could be doing active job search, which is defined as filling out applications, sending out CVs, or contacting employers or friends about jobs. they could be going to interviews, or they could be doing sort of other more passive search things, which would be like browsing the internet for jobs. And if you look at this, basically this says that 81% of the time that employed people are searching for a job, they search, they're doing active job search activities. So out of those 2 hours, 81% is active job search, 14% is interviewing. And I just want to note here that, again, we're comparing here the unemployed and out of the labor force. They look very similar, right? In fact, these out of the labor force guys are actually interviewing more than the unemployed. So they're really doing the same things. I mean, they're spending a little bit more time in this sort of more passive job search, but it's a very small number. And the same is true for the prime age workers. Okay. So the next step is to kind of think about who are these searchers, right? What characteristics do they have? So to answer that question, I'm going to run a two-stage Heckman selection model on the group of non-employed individuals, where selection based on observables is coming, selection into or out of the labor force. And then the second stage, I'm just going to look at a linear probability model with the dummy variable for if the individual searched on the interview day. And so to have accurate estimates here, I need an instrument for selection. And the instrument I'm going to use is whether or not the individual was the same respondent in the ATUS or the CPS. So Kruger et al. in 2017 basically gave us some insight into why there's so much measurement error in the CPS. And it's because they showed that the longer people stay in the survey, that they answer the questions differently and they get classified more often as out of the labor force. So basically this instrument is along the same lines, saying if you also happen to be the person who was responding to the CPS interview, there's a chance that you'll be classified differently because you're answering the questions differently, but presumably that's not affecting your actual job search activity. Okay.
Sorry, do you have this information on how many months did the person actually responded to the CPS survey?
Oh, so I guess I could do that. I haven't done that. I would have to sort of match everybody.
I was wondering because there's a lot of attrition as well. CPS is very similar to a survey you had in but it's just 4-8 months, 4-8-4 months
right.
interview, kind of interview, right? Yeah. So,
right. So I guess I could. That would probably be a better instrument, actually. But I didn't think about doing that because I would have to sort of match everybody over the whole thing. Right now, I'm just matching them to their last CPS interview and seeing if it's the same person.
And one thing that was not clear. So the time used survey is 2 months after the CPS, but after which interview? I was
the very last. Sorry, yeah.
The very last. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But then how do you map to exactly to if the person was out of the labor force or unemployed in the last answer to the CPS? To map this into the last answer to the CPS?
Oh no. So you mean in the ATUS?
Yes.
Yeah, no, so the ATUS, they're going to ask about, basically what they do is they ask all the CPS questions that could have changed again. So they won't ask you about like your sex or your age or something, but they ask basically anything that could have changed between the 2 to 5 months gap again. So they just ask the question again and categorize everyone the same again.
So maybe one thing you could do is to show if there were many changes between this last answer to the CPS and the answer they give in the time use survey. See what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, at that point though, it's hard to know, right? Because potentially these were 5 months ago, so it's hard to know if it was just because they actually stopped searching for a job or they actually started searching for a job.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So looking a bit about the demographics of people who are searching while they're considered out of the labor force, I highlighted sort of the biggest ones here, which is education. So education, so these numbers here are relative to having less than a high school degree. So you can see that more educated people are much less likely to be classified as out of the labor force, but conditional on being classified as out of the labor force, they're much, much more likely to be searching for a job. So this is a linear probability model, right? So this is 31 percentage points increase on the daily search probability. So if you aggregate that up to a monthly probability, that's a huge probability that they're searching for a job while they're being classified as out of the labor force. So that's kind of the biggest driver here of the demographic variables. You can see women with children also more likely to be classified as out of the labor force, more likely to be searching for a job. Race also seems to be a good predictor of, or a good indicator of whether or not they're searching for a job. Okay, so so I'm not going to use the Heckman selection because I want to maximize prediction power of the model. So I'm going to use a logistic function on the American Time Use Survey for each labor force status. I'm going to estimate a logit model for the probability that somebody is searching for a job based on all of their characteristics. It's going to be net elastic regularization, and I'm going to set the alpha parameter close to the lasso. The one sort of different thing that I'm going to do here, though, is I'm going to only have a certain set of characteristics with a penalty. So let me explain which ones those are and why I do that. So the predictors without a penalty that I'm forcing into the regression are going to, or into the logistic model, are going to be just the purely demographic variables. So female, age squared, education, child, married, race, and for the employed, whether they're full-time or part-time. And then also day of the week fixed effects. So which day the interview was on. So the reason I'm forcing those into the model is because in the end, I want the unemployment rate to be invariant to these changes in these larger demographic groups. All right, so this is a big discussion about the natural rate of unemployment decreasing because it's not taking into account that there's demographic change in the group of unemployed. So this is going to sort of bypass that problem and say, okay, we're going to adjust the unemployment rate so that females always count the same, and each education group always counts the same. But I still want to sort of do my best job at maximizing the predictive power. So I'm going to run it with interaction variables, and those are the ones I'm going to let the algorithm choose over to maximize prediction. Okay. These are just the ones that it chooses. I mean, they're not that informative, obviously, because the parameter estimates don't really mean much. Yeah, I don't really have much to say about that slide. Okay. So once I have the estimates from the American Time Use Survey, I'm going to take those estimates to the current population survey, and I'm going to predict for each person 7 daily probabilities, right? So in my model, I have day of the week fixed effects. So for each person, I'm going to estimate 7 probabilities, 1 for each day of the week. And then I'm going to predict the weekly search probability as 1 minus the cumulative product of not searching 7 days in a row. And then the monthly probability, which is the final probability that I'm going to use, is 1 minus the cumulative probability that they didn't search 4.71 weeks in the month. All right, so again, you should interpret this number as having searched at least once during the month.
So Christine, perhaps I misunderstood your empirical strategy, but you are accounting somehow for the time variation in, I don't know, unemployment insurance. For instance, during the crisis, you have this huge increase in the eligibility of unemployment insurance that should interact with those characteristics in some non-trivial way. And once you try to measure the search probability of those groups, they should vary a lot over time. And that has implications, for instance, once you try to reconcile the timer puzzle with the data, for instance. One way to reconcile, one way to close the gap between the timer puzzle and the data is to allow for higher unemployment insurance. So your series is, as far as is understood, is not taking account for that, right?
So yeah, so it's not taking account of that, mostly because I don't have that information. So I can't tell whether or not they're accepting unemployment insurance or not. Yeah, I guess I'd have to somehow match it with another data set, but I don't have the information whether or not they actually, I guess I could maybe try to figure out if they're eligible for unemployment insurance, but I can't figure out if they're actually receiving unemployment insurance.
It's not only about the unemployment insurance, it's only one example. It's not only about that, but for instance, the nature of the match. There is these stories during the Great Recession that the match in some sectors was easier than the match in other sectors, and the people with some demographic characteristics should search more intensively in some sectors than others. And I'm concerned more on how those search probabilities vary over time, not with the cross-sectional dimension, but the time series dimension.
Oh, I see, okay. Yeah,
which should be important to reconcile with those macro models, the Phillips curve and so on.
Yeah, so okay, I think I understand your question. So in terms of, with respect to like the demographic variables, because I want to project back to the 1980s, I can't have time varying demographic effects. What I have done in the past, which ended up not making too big of a difference, was I put in state level business cycle indicators, right? So to try to, with respect to search effort, to try to get some time variation in the probability that someone is searching based on the state that they live in and business cycle indicators like employment within the state. So I did try to do that. It ended up not making very much of a difference. I mean, especially in terms of the Phillips curve, it really didn't change my estimates there. And in terms of the level change, it really didn't make a big difference. I remember it, this was such a long time ago. I remember it having a little bit of a change with respect to the volatility, as you're suggesting, because if you include business cycle effects in the search probabilities, you're going to get that they're even more counter-cyclical than I'm finding. But the change in the how counter-cyclical they are was not that large to affect any, the Phillips curve or the volatility of the tightness. The issue with that, of course, could be either really it is demographic changes over the business cycle that is creating the counter-cyclical movements, or I just didn't have a great measure of the business cycle effects, right? So, but I can't really, I mean, if you have any suggestions on like what I should be putting in there to capture that, because I've definitely tried that before, but what I tried ended up not really mattering, and it seemed kind of ad hoc, so I decided to take it out, but.
I don't have any suggestions. I'm learning.
But your point is absolutely well taken, and I've looked into it, but I mean, maybe it's something I should look deeper into, but I can't, at this point, I couldn't figure anything else out, okay. Right, so I've gone through and predicted all of these probabilities. So just kind of looking, I just want to show you guys the distributions of these things so you can see what comes out of these predicted probabilities. So these are the percentiles over the entire time span. So from 1980 to 2020, you can see that most of the employed, I mean, this is really skewed towards 1 here. You can also see that the out of the labor force, basically, there's a large group of people who are really not searching throughout the month. Obviously, these are your, your children and your grandparents who are not searching for a job. But what is interesting here is if we look at sort of the upper tail of this distribution, right? So the 90th and 95th, we can see that especially here we have this big jump, right? So basically the prediction is saying, okay, there's this large group of people who aren't really searching very much, but then there's another group of people in the out of labor force who are predicted to be searching quite a bit, and they're predicted to be searching more than the employed actually. Okay. How much time do I have? Okay, perfect. So as I promised at the beginning, I want to also just ensure that this predicted probability here actually is a measure of labor force attachment, right? That it's not just sort of some random predicted thing that I'm going to weight people by. So I'm going to show that it's a measure of labor force attachment by regressing this on 3 different measures of labor force attachment. So the first one is going to be a measure of the job finding probability, a measure of hours worked once they become employed, and for the group of employed job switchers, it's going to be the change in their hours worked. Okay, so how I do that is I match people over 2 consecutive months. And I take their, if for the job finding probability, it's going to be an indicator here for if they became employed in the 2nd month. And I'm just going to regress that on their predicted job search effort from the previous month. And I'm going to put in year and month fixed effects in some of these. And then hours worked, this is just going to be hours. And for the employed, this is going to be the change in their hours worked if they find a job. So you can see that basically this is a good predictor of job finding probability. We have a large correlation here, a fairly large correlation between how many hours they work once they find a job, and the change in hours also for the employed. So this is just to kind of prove that this isn't a random thing that I'm going to weight by. It really is an accurate measure of labor force attachment. Okay, so this is now how the weighting is going to happen. So basically in the current population survey, I'm going to take the group of people who are considered employed, and I'm going to create what I call the employed searchers by taking the weight, the sampling weight of that person and multiplying by their predicted search probability. For the unemployed, this is the same thing here. Remember that most of these are going to be really close to 1 or equal to 1. So it's going to come out with the number of unemployed job searchers. It's going to be really close to the number of unemployed people. And for the out of the labor force, same thing. I just weight by their predicted probability. Okay, so here's what comes out. So the blue line, I've only plotted this for employed and out of the labor force. Like I said, for the unemployed, this is going to be a line that's fairly flat at like 97%. Okay, but so for the employed people, we can see a little bit of an increase here, but then it's been fairly stable. It seems to be slightly counter-cyclical, except we have this little drop here in the most current recession. And then this is really where I make this point that this fraction has really increased. It's gone from 9.5% to, after the Great Recession, to about 13%, and now we're back up to 13% as well in this recession. And I would imagine that this is just going to keep rising as time goes on. So basically we have, if you consider that this is about a 3.5 percentage point increase, that's about 7 million job searchers in the US that were not considered, or an increase of 7 million job seekers that we're not considering when we don't look at the out of the labor force people. Okay. So I also kind of investigate a little bit about why we have this increase. So the solid blue line here is just the same line that I plotted before. And then what I do is I resample and I create counterfactual series in which I only allow one demographic characteristic to change within the sample, but I hold the others fixed at the 1980 values. So for example, the series labeled sex, which is this red line, is I hold fixed education, race, and all the other demographic characteristics at their 1980 values. And I just allow the gender distribution within the pool of unemployed to change over time. And you can see that education is really driving this thing upwards. Race and sex are also driving this thing upwards a little bit. And age actually sort of has a nice mitigating effect to this problem, which is that it hasn't, the pool of out of the labor force people are getting much older, which is sort of mitigating this problem that we're seeing this increase here. And it actually seems to be playing the larger role for why we have this decrease after the Great Recession here. So it's really demographic, it's really education, sex, and race, which are driving these changes here. Okay. So now the point again, right, is to compare how the unemployment rate changes, participation changes, and what effect that has on how well we think these models are working and greater macroeconomic implications. So let me just show what the adjusted unemployment rate here is, right? So now I'm going to take the total number of unemployed job searchers, total number of out of the labor force searchers, divided by labor force participation in this sense, which is employed and the two groups of searchers. Same with the participation rate. Basically, these people who are searching from out of the labor force get added in here. And then this is this brand new statistic, which we haven't really seen before, which is the total searcher rate, right? So this is the total number of people searching, including these employed searchers, divided by the labor force. Okay. And here's what these adjustments look like. So the blue line is the standard unemployment rate. The red line is the adjusted unemployment rate, and the green line here is the total searcher rate. So it's a little bit difficult to see in this graph, but you can see, well, especially now with this new recession, there is a bit of a downward trend here. I mean, I think that would be hard to say now with this spike here, but people were very concerned with this and the natural rate of unemployment decreasing. But if you look at the red line, there's really no trend here that we can see, and the green line also has no trend. Again, it's a bit hard to see on these graphs because of the axis, but right. So this line here is, like I said, 5.3 percentage points higher. And if we look at the participation rate here, again, it's going to be much higher. But also you can see that, for example, after the 2001 recession, misclassification accounts for the entire decrease that we observed in the unemployment, or sorry, in the labor force participation rate in the US. And then after the Great Recession, it accounts for about 25% of this drop in the participation rate. So a lot of this drop can be explained by the aging of the workforce, but a lot of it is unexplained, and about 25% of the entire drop is explained by just people being misclassified. Okay. Yeah. All right, so let me also correct the labor market flows. So let me just quickly say, I won't go into detail how this is done in the CPS, but basically it's done just like that table I showed at the beginning. You match people across consecutive months and you track where they're moving, and you can calculate the rates based on how many people moved from each state to other states. And the new calculation is going to be slightly different. So the new calculation is going to use these predicted search probabilities. And if let's say I observe someone who moved from employment to non-employment, I say that they moved from employment to unemployment. I count them as their weight times the predicted probability that they're searching in month 2. And I count them as out of the labor force when I take the predicted, or sorry, their sampling weight times the probability that they were not searching in month 2. Then again, for the non-employed people, I classify them as a UE transition by taking the weight times the probability that they were searching for a job in the first month. Now, these UO and OU transitions, let me explain these intuitively because these equations aren't very intuitive, but basically what I do is I observe someone 2 times in the group of non-employed people. If their predicted probability does not change, then they contribute to no flow. But basically I say that they stayed, let's say their predicted probability in both months was 0.5. 0.5% of their mass contributes to the stock of unemployed, and 0.5% of their mass contributes to the stock of unemployed, but they contribute nothing to the flows. If, for example, they're predicted to be searching with 0.2 in the first month and 0.5 in the second month, then I say that they contributed only to the flow from out of the labor force to unemployment because they increased their probability of searching, and they contribute with the weight, I guess that would be this line here, the weight times the difference of their probabilities. So in the example I gave, that would be their weight times 0.3. If instead they decrease their search probability, they contribute to the flow from unemployment to out of the labor force by exactly how much they decrease their search probability. And then by construction, the flow from O to U, I'm going to constrain that to be 0. Then there's a lot of adjusting that goes on here. They're going to be seasonally adjusted. They're going to be adjusted for margin error. So this is one thing that's usually done. Basically, this is going to constrain the flows so that the flows are consistent with the stocks of unemployed, out of the labor force, and employed. And then I'm going to aggregate them to quarterly. Okay, so here's what comes out. So on the left here, we have the standard flows, and on the right, we have the adjusted flows. So these are the average of the quarterly transition probabilities over the whole period. So from 1980 to 2020. And most of these are fairly similar. There's just 2 big changes here, which is along this unemployment margin. So we saw this earlier, that the unemployment is not a very persistent state, and they're almost as likely to exit unemployment through employment or out of the labor force. And if you look at the adjusted flows, it becomes a much more persistent state, and they're much, much less likely to exit unemployment to out of the labor force. And everything else is fairly similar. There are actually a little bit of changes here in the employed being more likely, in the standard flows, an employed person is more likely to exit to out of the labor force than to unemployment. And in the adjusted flows, they're more likely to exit to unemployment rather than non-participation. Okay, so just a reminder of why this matters, right? So Per Crucell and co-authors wrote a whole series of papers saying that the only way to get this huge number here is through really, really large preference shocks. And they actually show that if you don't have these preference shocks, you get very small numbers like this, right? So the paper is basically saying, you know, the model can sort of match this adjusted probability, which is more likely to be sort of an accurate representation of unemployment without preference shocks. Okay. Right, so here's the volatility of the labor market. So I've looked at sort of the key statistics of volatility, which is job seekers. So standard here is, this is the volatility of the unemployment rate. Adjusted, this is the volatility of the adjusted unemployment rate, and total searchers, this is the volatility of the total searcher rate that I showed. And what I've done here is I've taken the standard deviation of the logged statistic. It's slightly different than what Scheimer does. Scheimer takes an HP filter, but I didn't want to do that, so I'm just doing the standard deviation of the logged statistic. So basically, one standard deviation in the unemployment rate is about 30% from its mean, and one standard deviation of the adjusted unemployment rate is only about 15% from its mean. So it's a lot less volatile. The vacancy rate, right? This is the number of vacancies per labor force. So the reason it changes here, right, is because the labor force changes between standard labor force and the adjusted labor force, but it doesn't change the volatility of the vacancy rate very much. And then tightness here is the V over the searchers. So in terms of the standard unemployment rate, basically a one standard deviation is 46% increase in the tightness. And if you look at the adjusted number, it's 35% increase. And if you look at the total searcher rate, which is probably the most accurate thing to be plugging into this, if you have, especially if you have on the job search, it's only a 30% increase from its mean.
But Chris, those numbers are still far to solve the puzzle. Now, if I recall that correctly, the Scheimer, the model statistics was one order of magnitude smaller than the data. So it's still far, right?
Yeah, so I mean, so the problem with Scheimer's paper is that he HP filters everything, right? So you can really get these numbers to be anything that you want when you HP filter by just changing the the filtering parameter. So if I really wanted to show like how big of a difference this made for the Scheimer puzzle, I would need to go and calibrate the model and not HP filter the data. But in terms of magnitude, yes. So he basically shows, right, that through the standard productivity shocks, the volatility of the tightness was an order of magnitude smaller. You're right. Yeah, so it doesn't solve the problem all the way. I'm not claiming it solves the problem all the way, but it definitely takes us one big step closer, right? I mean, especially if you're thinking about total searchers, right? I mean, this is a pretty big reduction here in the volatility.
And sorry if I may, it also depends on the shock itself. So he's assuming, Scheimer is assuming that you know, everything is driven by productivity shocks, but that's, I mean, we don't know what is part of productivity shocks. I mean, if you were to change the shock itself, you would get different numbers. So very not.
Yeah, so I think in his paper he goes through, right, he goes through a productivity shock. He also goes through a separation rate shock, and he also does a bargaining parameter shock. But yeah, I mean, it's funny calling it a puzzle, right? We all know what the problem is. It's the wage in the model that's sort of absorbing everything, right? But I guess the point I'm trying to make is, you know, I'm arguing that really, if you want to calibrate something about the volatility of the labor market, you really, especially if you have on-the-job search, you really should be looking at this number and not looking at labor market tightness as vacancies over unemployed. But yeah, I mean, and we know how to solve the problem too, right, with the bargaining parameter. Okay, so also here the separation rate shock, right, decreases volatility quite a bit actually as well. Okay. All right, let me see. Do I go until 4? I think that's right, right?
45. So, okay.
Oh, 45, okay, perfect.
Yeah. 50
okay, this is the
about,
okay, so this is the last thing I have anyways. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to basically re-estimate a super naive Phillips curve to show that even in the most naive situation, you don't really have this problem anymore. So the standard the standard sort of Phillips curve that people estimate, right, is they take the unemployment rate difference from the natural rate of unemployment, which is this U star here, which is time varying. And what I'm going to use for that is this natural rate of unemployment from the CBO. And then for inflation expectations, I'm going to use a backwards looking Phillips curve. So I'm just going to take the average of the previous 4 quarters of inflation as the inflation expectations. And the change in the unemployment rate post the Great Recession is going to be captured by this phi2 parameter here, right? It's the change where this post is an indicator for after the Great Recession. I'm also going to allow the expectations to change after the Great Recession. And then for the adjusted unemployment rate, and the total searcher rate here, I'm going to do this with just the standard unemployment rate or total searcher rate, where the difference from the natural rate of both of those measures is going to be soaked up into this constant here, because I'm going to estimate it as a constant natural rate of unemployment or a constant natural rate of total searchers. So the change parameter here is going to be captured by this phi2. Sorry, this should be an X here, where it's the either adjusted unemployment rate or total searcher rate times an indicator for being post-Great Recession. Okay. I'm also going to do the same thing for a wage Phillips curve, where just instead of using inflation here, I use annualized quarterly wage growth. And the idea is going to be the same. The change is going to be captured in this phi2 parameter here. Right. Okay. So here's what's going to come out. So this first 3 columns are the wage Phillips curve. And you can see here, so even the wage Phillips curve in the data from 1980 to 2019, you can see that there's basically a flattening of the wage Phillips curve. and it's significant. And if we compare that to the adjusted unemployment rate, so pre the 2008 recession, we have a indistinguishable number from the standard unemployment rate. But you can see that here in this indicator for being post the 2008 recession, we really have no change in this parameter. Meaning that there is no change in the slope of the Phillips curve once you use the adjusted unemployment rate. And the same is true for the total searcher rate. In fact, we get an even stronger, but still not statistically different from the standard unemployment rate, but the point estimate is stronger, and no change in the post-recession period. And if we look at just the inflation Phillips curve, we see exactly the same thing. So we see a negative coefficient, although it's not significant here in the pre-recession period, with a big change in the post-recession period. And that big change is not present for the adjusted unemployment rate, which is very similar pre-recession estimate. And the total searcher rate, again, my argument here is that really this is the correct measure for labor underutilization, because it's including employed job seekers. We get a very big negative coefficient and no change in the post 2008 recession period.
So one quick question: if you look those graphs you presented a few slides before, the common used measure of unemployment have a downward trend, and you kind of fix that downward trend, accounting for some of the characteristics, some of the demographics, and that I can see that we can kind of recover the Phillips curve before the crisis. So my question is, what are the characteristics that are more important to correcting the trend once you account for search intensities?
Okay, let me see if I understood the question. Are you asking whether it's more important to be adding the out of the labor force searchers, or it's more important that I'm doing basically the demographic adjustment and not allowing the unemployment rate to vary because of changes in the demographic group? Is that the question?
Yeah, my question, yes, is like, what are the changes in the demographics that is driving this result?
Okay, so yeah, let me say what's driving the results, right? So what's driving the result is that I no longer have to rely on this Congressional Budget Office natural rate of unemployment. And I can just estimate the natural rate of unemployment as being a constant in this regression, because there's no trend in the unemployment rate anymore, right? So I can difference it out by just having a constant, right? Aishagul Sahin and co-authors have a very nice paper about sort of trying to measure a time-varying natural rate of unemployment such that it's not perfectly matching a Phillips curve while you're estimating that, right? So that's the biggest issue with trying to estimate a Phillips curve and having a time-varying natural rate of unemployment is we can't really independently estimate those two things. And what I'm saying here is that if there's no trend in the unemployment rate, we don't need a time varying natural rate of unemployment to estimate the Phillips curve. So really what's most important is that there's no trend in the unemployment rate. And the reason there's no trend in the unemployment rate is because of this increase in the fraction of out of the labor force that's searching. And the reason that's increasing, right, is because of just the demographic composition of the people that were being classified as out of the labor force. So that's the education has increased quite a bit in people that are classified as out of the labor force, and also the race and the gender. Okay, I hope that answered the question, but it's a very complicated. Okay.
I got it. Thanks.
Okay, so anyway, I'm done now. So I think I've made the 3 points, hopefully well enough. Okay, I just said I spent a long time on this last one, right? The unemployment rate doesn't have this downward trend when we account for all of these searchers. Unemployment, another big thing that comes out of this, which is focused more on sort of the search and matching side of the modeling, is that the unemployment rate is much more persistent, which is exactly what our search and matching models are better at matching. They have a hard time matching sort of these flows between out of the labor force and unemployment. And labor market volatility overall is slower. And sort of thinking to the future, some interesting things that can kind of come from this is considering maybe thinking about search efficiency, right? So the way that I'm weighting the people in the unemployment rate right now is just how much they're searching, but it doesn't, I could be a very efficient searcher and not search very much, but find a job very quickly. So kind of taking efficiency into account somehow. Also maybe considering a more sophisticated intensive margin. So like I talked about the number of minutes spent searching or number of applications that were sent out. Although I think the data on that is much harder. And then, as a broader issue, I've kind of showed at the beginning that this is not just an issue in the US. This is an issue within Europe, and sort of thinking about making the European unemployment rates also just more comparable across countries. Yeah.
Great, Christine. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was great. Is there any more question, Gustavo?
Yeah, let me ask a question. Yeah, I was just curious about. First of all, it's very interesting what you presented, but if I understood well, you're using the time use survey. And then they replicate the same questions they had in the CPS to classify people as out of the labor force or unemployed. So what really intrigues me at the end is like, how come like people answer a lot of questions about time use, saying that they are actually searching for a job, and then they answer that they are not searching for a job.
Right. I mean, to be honest, I can't really answer that question. However, I can say that there is when I was looking into the mismeasurement issue, there's a paper, I think maybe it was Kruger also, I can't remember off the top of my head who it was, but oh yeah, no, it was that Kruger with the rotation group bias, right? They basically showed that the longer people stay in this survey, they know what's coming, right? The first time they answered unemployed, and they know that there's this huge set of questions coming after that. So they're just like, nope, I'm not employed. So what I can imagine is happening in the American Time Use Survey is the same thing, right? They're like, oh no, I'm just gonna say I'm out of the labor force because I know I have to answer all those other questions.
Right, and then they answered these questions at the beginning of the survey.
I'm not sure. Yeah, but either way, I mean,
it would perfectly fit this story, right?
Well, I think
answer these questions, and then they just blah, 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 and then they answer the new questions on time use more towards the end.
I mean, I think even if they answered the time use questions first, right? Even if they said I don't think people really care about being that consistent about their answers in these surveys, right? I mean, I can fill in my time use, and then I come to the CPS portion. I know if I put unemployed, I'm going to have to spend even more time on the survey. So I just say out of the labor force. Yeah. So.
Okay.
Christine?
Yeah.
Hello, I'm a student in the university. Is there any consideration into the age of the searchers? Like the age of their age might affect the efficiency of the search. So people with more age and might be more efficient than people that are younger.
Right. So, I mean, age, right? The only role that age is playing right now is determining how much a person is searching. So basically, really old people are not searching very much. But the effect of age on efficiency, I'm not capturing that, right? So that is actually one of the things I was thinking about in the future, thinking about, as you suggested, if older searchers might be more efficient because they have larger networks, but I haven't considered any aspect of efficiency in what I'm doing right now. But so for the future, if I consider efficiency, then I would assume that age would matter there as well. But right now, the only role age is playing is determining the probability that you're searching, not your efficiency.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Is there any more question? No. So thanks a lot, Christine. And now I think you have a break, and then you're gonna speak with Gustavo and Rafael. Okay.
Okay.
Then
Great.
use
Thank
the
you very
other
much.
link. Yes. Then don't forget to use the other link, the meeting link.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
a lot.
Thank you.
It was great to have you.
All right. Yes.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Bye.
Bye.